Hi, I'm Samuel C. Spitali, author of How to Win the War on Truth. In this video, we'll look at the truth about the war on drugs. On the surface, the war on drugs sounded like an initiative to combat rising crime rates, even though there was scant evidence linking criminal behavior to drug use. The drug war's real purpose, however, was political. In 1968, Richard Nixon campaigned for president on a platform of law and order, as part of a backlash to the civil rights movement and the decade's political unrest. Once in office, he needed to demonstrate his tough-on-crime commitment. The problem was that most crime is handled at the state level, so the Nixon administration had to find a legislative niche to call their own. Because drugs traveled across state lines, drug crime became the vehicle for that law and order message. It worked for the administration because it targeted their most vocal opponents: hippies, black people, and anti-war activists. So the Nixon White House set about linking unrest on college campuses to the race riots of the inner city. Because drugs were common in both groups of protesters, Nixon could cast them as lawless criminals rather than address students' concerns about the Vietnam War or black people's concerns about racial discrimination, poverty, and police brutality. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, who spent over a year in prison for conspiracy and perjury in the Watergate scandal, explained it best. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. We knew that we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This strategy became the war on drugs, a term coined by Nixon himself. Nixon declared his drug war in 1971, at a time when more people died falling downstairs or from choking than from drug use. In fact, barely 1% of students smoked weed daily, compared to 33% who smoked cigarettes. In 1973, Nixon established the DEA to carry out his new drug policy. To drum up public support, his staff gathered TV's biggest producers to pitch drug-related storylines on Mission Impossible, Hawaii Five-0, Andy Griffith, and many others. The Nixon White House was the first to explicitly ask television executives to tailor their scripts to a president's political policy. Within months, drug abuse was featured on The Mod Squad, General Hospital, and Love American Style, which gave the impression that drug abuse was more rampant than it was. What had been a largely rhetorical war on drugs under Nixon became a physical reality under Ronald Reagan, despite less than 2% of the nation thinking it was the most pressing issue at hand. Reagan dramatically shifted drug policy by militarizing the police, scrapping penal rehabilitation programs, and enlisting the help of the FBI in addition to the DEA. To rally congressional support, Reagan's staff lobbied the news media to create the perception that cocaine use was rampant among America's youth. This resulted in 10 cover stories in 12 months in Newsweek and Time magazine alone, and nearly 1,000 stories about crack in other magazines and newspapers, with articles about so-called crack babies entirely fabricated. Meanwhile, only 4% of high schoolers reported ever using drugs, and drug use overall, as well as drug crimes, had been abating for years. Nevertheless, these news stories reinforce racial stereotypes that the Reagan administration used to justify 100-to-1 sentencing laws, under which crack possession led to a prison sentence 100 times longer than that of cocaine possession, even though the drug's chemical effects are identical. This meant that a black man with 5 grams of crack got a 5-year prison sentence, while white people had to possess 500 grams of cocaine to get the same punishment. Prior to 1988, the maximum prison sentence for drug violations was 1 year. Now the average sentence is nearly 7 years, with some nonviolent drug offenders sentenced to as many as 30 years, longer than Nazis sentenced at the Nuremberg trials. In the rest of the world, drug sentences are only a matter of months. In 2010, the Obama administration reduced the 100-to-1 disparity to 18-to-1, yet the chemical effects of cocaine and crack are still identical. These types of racially biased drug laws essentially gave police carte blanche to lock up the sort of people they wanted to lock up, namely blacks and Latinos, which created a 943% increase in the prison population in the past 50 years. nearly half of incarcerated Americans are serving sentences for drug charges, 90% of whom are Black and Latino men, even though Black people are only 15% of drug users. Yet studies show that white people actually use drugs at considerably higher rates than Black people, and white people are more likely to deal drugs and engage in drug crimes, and are 3 times as likely to visit the emergency room for drug-related reasons. One study published by the National Institute on Drug Abuse reported that white students use cocaine at 7 times the rate of Black students. They use crack cocaine at 8 times the rate of Black students, and they use heroin at 7 times the rate of Black students. Nevertheless, Black people are 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs than white people, and 3 times more likely to be arrested. Black people are so targeted by police that 1 in 3 Black men will go to prison during his lifetime. In New York, Black and Latino males between the ages of 14 and 24 make up 4.7% of the New York population, but they account for over 40% of the stop and frisk checks by police. And a whopping 90% of those stopped were found innocent. By 2010, there were twice as many Black men in the criminal justice system as were enslaved before the Civil War. And that's largely because of Nixon and Reagan's war on drugs, conceived and implemented as a way to expel unwanted minorities from society after they were granted civil rights. Instead of incorporating Black men into the economy or addressing their valid socioeconomic concerns, the Nixon and Reagan administrations chose to lock them up, breaking up their families, destabilizing their communities, and subverting the promise of the civil rights movement. As John Ehrlichman summarized it, "Look, we understood we couldn't make it illegal to be young or poor or Black in the United States, but we could criminalize their common pleasure. We understood that drugs were not the health problem we were making them out to be, but it was such a perfect issue for the Nixon White House that we couldn't resist it." To read more, check out my book, How to Win the War on Truth, and be sure to like and subscribe. Special thanks to Alan Wincup for the illustrations, and thank you for watching.